let's get down to the basics of how to hack the ACT English test. You can ignore this part down in the bottom because you're already enrolled in an online course if you're listening to this, and that means that you're awesome. So let's continue. This is our FAQ for the English test. Basically, it's the rundown, exactly what you need to know in order to prepare at a basic level for the English test. So the English test is 45 minutes long and it has 75 questions. That will give you a timing of about 1 minute to scan the passage, maybe between 1 minute to a minute and a half, and an average of 30 seconds per question, although many of the questions can be answered more quickly than this. This gives you an idea of the timing that you'll have to have. And just as a short side note, make sure that you use the note sections that's located in the workbook pages. This would be something that I write down, and this is something that you should practice on each time you take a practice test. 1 minute to a minute and a half to scan the passage, and an average of 30 seconds per question. Now, there's a process called what I like to call banking. You can bank time on questions that don't take as long to answer, which means that you can kind of keep up with them and know that you have a little bit more time on harder questions. This will help if you can recognize easy questions for what they are and not talk yourself out of the answer. We'll get to that later. The average score for the ACT English test is a 20, and pretty much you have to answer 50 questions just to get that 20. The difference that to score in the 90th percentile, you need a 29. But if you're going to go for a 29, it's even better to just add another point or two, because a 30 plus is very competitive for scholarships across the nation. Now, I mentioned that you have to answer almost 2/3 of the questions correct just to get an average score, but you can miss up to 10 and still get a 28. So understand that you have a much larger margin of error the higher you go, which means it's actually a little bit easier to go from a 30 to a 34 than it is to go from a 20 to a 24. Just saying. So understand also that a perfect score is, well, on the English test, it's usually, well, perfect. There are a couple of tests on the ACT where the ACT scoring guide will allow you to miss maybe even one question. So understand that, so a 36 isn't always perfect, but in this case, it means that we're going to have to do a lot of work if you want to get in the high 30s on the ACT English test. What's on the test? Well, these are the different types of questions that you're going to be asked. If you identify a weakness in any of these areas, it's important to focus on that area. You'll have links embedded in the online course to additional videos that you can use to prepare and practice. What you should study are ideas like punctuation, subject-verb agreement, verb forms and agreement, pronouns, adjectives, and certainly sentence structure, which is worth about 24% of this test points. So you'll see other highly assessed areas are grammar and usage, style, and strategy. So if you're going through the practice and review section of this chapter, then make sure you don't skip these. What you shouldn't bother to study are spelling, vocabulary, specific grammar rules. You don't have to remember the rules, and certainly you don't have to understand slang, because the ACT will not assess these things. Vocabulary is one of those things where it's not directly assessed on the ACT, but of course, having a very good vocabulary will help you comprehend and understand what you're reading a lot better. I've included this heat graph, and for the first time only, I'm going to show you another test as well. I'm going to show you the mathematics, so you get an idea about how you have to have different strategies based on different tests. And so part of what you're going to do in preparation for the test is memorize the rules and coach yourself through each test, so that when you know that you're going to begin the English test, you're telling yourself, I have a minute to a minute and a half to read the passage. I have 30 seconds per question. But my strategy is also going to differ in how I approach the questions. On the math test, if you'll look first, it makes sense to actually start at the beginning, where the easy questions are indicated in green, where the darkest green is the easiest question, and the more difficult questions are indicated in red, where the intense red indicates the intensity of the question. What that shows is that on the math test, if you work from the beginning to the end, then you will actually approach and have the best chance of answering the most questions correctly. It does not make sense on the math test to work backwards, which some students like to do, because that will mean that you're dedicating most of your time to answering really difficult questions first. These questions are questions that you are more likely to get wrong, and they're questions that take more time. Since the ACT assesses all items and gives them the same value, each question is worth the same amount of points, then we have to be strategic about how we approach different questions and tests. Now, if we look at the English test, then you'll see that the level of difficulty of questions are dispersed. But what you'll often find is that each passage that you're going to read, and there'll be about 5, each of those passages is going to have 15 questions. And out of those 15 questions, some of them are going to be easy and some of them are going to be difficult. And there's not really a strategy for knowing where those difficult questions are going to come. So if you work from the beginning to the end on the English test, what a lot of students fail to do is to try to focus on the easy questions. We're going to talk about what those easy questions look like next, but understand that the strategy here is to get the most points that you can, which means if you approach a difficult question, you may decide to come back to that question later. Just make sure that you hold your place on the answer sheet and skip and make sure that you mark your answers in the appropriate place. This may help some students who are not able to finish on time. Now, the ACT does not penalize you for guessing. What that means is that if you get to the last minute, it's to your advantage to make sure you've answered all questions correctly. We'll talk about that under specific strategies as well. There's a right answer and then there's a best answer on this test. Your job is to find the best answer. You find the best answer by answering the questions that you know first, by answering the questions that you can answer with a little additional time second, and by guessing on the questions that you haven't had time to answer or that are very difficult for you to answer last. The ACT is like chess. It's about strategy, which means that you may have to sacrifice some things in order to get a higher score. If you're aiming in the high 30s or for a perfect score, then you're going to have to move quickly, efficiently, and you're going to have to answer correctly. Most of the English questions follow a standard format, and so it's easy for you to identify the green level questions and your easier type of questions. A word, phrase, or sentence in the passage is underlined, thereby pointing specifically to where you need to look. You're given 4 options to leave the underlined portion unchanged or to replace it with one of the 3 alternatives. Do not make the mistake that some students make by ignoring the no change option and looking for mistakes. This is going to be your answer roughly 25% of the time. So don't forget that there is a no change option. And if there isn't a better alternative, if the other answer choice creates a different problem, or if the sentence is simple and fine the way it is, then you can choose no change. Now, here, the answer choices go from F to J, and then from A, B, C, D. And this will help you sort of keep track. If you make sure that you put your finger on the answer choice for your document for your question and make sure that you're bubbling in the corresponding space on the answer document. It helps to use your fingers to transition very quickly. And in addition, you should practice circling the answers in the answer document before bubbling them. That way, if there's ever a mistake and you need to go back and correct answers, you know what your intended answer was. A few items, about 10 on this test, are going to pose a question and offer 4 possible responses. Now, in this case, it takes a little bit more knowledge about the overall structure and purpose of the text. So, in many cases, the responses are yes and no with an explanation. So, here, they're asking you to make an evaluation of how well the author did their jobs. And so, these are a second level type of question. The next type of questions that you will experience on the ACT are others that ask you to determine the best order of words, sentences, or paragraphs. These types of questions almost make you the writer, and they expect you to not only understand the overall and in pretty well in good detail what the passage is about, how it develops, and what the author's purpose was, but it places you in the seat of driver to evaluate those things, which makes this type of question your third type of question. Those questions that are going to appear in dark red, which means that when you come across one of these questions, you can choose whether or not to attack it easily or to guess after you've eliminated at least 2 answer choices, or whether to skip it altogether, guess, and bank the time. Most non-standard questions will occur at the end of each passage. So that means that students should not waste a lot of time trying to answer these difficult questions at the end of one passage when there are other easy questions at the end of the next passages. What does that mean? That means instead of wasting a lot of time trying to answer one really difficult question, you could use that time to answer 4 or 5 really easy questions. That is a better bet, and that's a better strategy. That's a winning strategy for how to get a high score on the ACT. Now, specific strategies that we'll practice and that you should get down to a science for the English test are going to be these 4 things. When you scan the passage and you're giving a minute to a minute and a half, you should come away with 4 things. Many students often ask me whether it's better to look at the questions first. But the truth is, on the ACT, which is really predictable, you really can start to understand what questions they're going to ask you beforehand. You are going to be asked questions about the topic of the passage, about the verb tense, about the purpose and tone, and about the author's style of writing. So if you make mental notes or underline, circle as you go, these will be breadcrumbs that lead you quickly back to the right answer. So as we scan this passage, and we're going to give ourselves a minute to do so, we're going to determine the topic of the passage, which it helps to look at the title. If you understand why a passage is entitled the way it is, then you generally have an understanding of what the passage is about. We're also going to look at the verb tense, where verbs are not underlined. This tells me the overall tense of the passage. And since the ACT follows very, very strict and standard rules for consistent tense throughout the passage, then the underlined verbs will tell us what the author intended the tense of this passage to be. So we're going to focus on that. You'll see those in red. We should also note the purpose and tone. So is it to inform? And then how does the author sound? Do they sound very informal, somewhat more relaxed, or what's their deal? We also want to pay attention to the author's style of writing. What kind of words do they use? Are they sort of figurative and flowy like poets? Or are they sort of do they sort of get to the point? Either way, we want to pay attention to those things. I'm going to go ahead and set a timer here to use for the next section. Now, as we go, I'm going to flip to the new slide. And what we're going to see then is the passage that goes that we're going to try to answer questions for. We're going to have a minute, and we're going to try doing it in that time. We're going to look for these 4 things: the topic, the verb tense, the purpose, the tone, and style. Let's get started. The Beaux Arts architecture in the spotlight. Arts and architecture. Scanning through each sentence, and this process is going to be the first sentence of each paragraph. On the west of Orange Street in New York City, wedged between buildings more than twice its height, stands this theater. Okay, so I'm looking at verbs. I see stands. I see exemplifies, fuses, is, features, and extends. These are not underlined, so they are not things that could change. These are the way the author intended it to be, present tense. Next, I see that it's about a theater, that tourists come to see performances, so that's the art. And then, but there are also architecture buffs who come to admire the building itself. They look at the facade. The architecture is Greek and Roman, Renaissance, and what else? So this tells me that the purpose of this is to tell me about this theater, the type of people who attended. The person writes in a somewhat specific style because they talk about different architecture terms. Okay? And this is going to help me. That was my timer. This is going to help me understand how to answer the next questions. Now, we can understand under these next strategies once we've spent a minute. And actually, we had a little bit more time where we could have kind of specified that this is about the architecture of a specific theater. And it can get a little technical because it talks about like Greek and Roman and this facade. So the next thing that we should do is we should start to know what questions are testing. This actually allows us to filter through all the information we studied for this test and focus on one rule or group of rules per question. So question number 46, we're looking for the which question tests punctuation. Well, 46 has our no change option, and then it says that I can use they, apostrophe re, their, or its. All of these are pronoun, but it seems to be that they are testing possessive pronouns, especially ones like these that are often mistaken. 47 offers our no change, and also, so I know that this is going to be one of my simpler questions. It's not really a trick. It's just whether or not I know the rule and the best application of that rule. So here I can see that the difference in the choices are almost always commas, and then I see that there's a difference in the form of the verb. Okay, so the ACT English test may combine different things for you to look at. So try to find the differences between the answer choices to hone in on that. And so I see commas looks like it's going to be a pretty big part of what they're assessing here. So I want to know if I need to read this sentence with a break. Now, question number 48 has consequently, however, and in fact. They all have punctuation. They have a comma. And so what I think this is going to be testing is actually a second level question, because it requires me to understand how this passage is developing and which of these words best shows what it is that I'm supposed to do. Am I using consequently to show that there is a connection from one idea to the other in terms of cause and effect? Am I using however to show that although I've been talking about one idea, I'm going to go in a different direction in the latter part of this sentence? Or am I using the word in fact to show that the next idea is going to be an example or an extension of what I've just been saying? We'll look at these in a second. 49, it gives us the options for their, to, whom, and they. It basically is our testing pronouns, and it actually is one of those questions that's going to send a lot of people for a loop. We tend to want to gravitate towards whom because most people don't understand how it's used, and so we assume that we want to sound very formal. But the ACT usually likes the simplest, most clear and concise usage of words. So unless this word is used correctly, usually that there is a word like to or for whom, to whom, and it's going to be used as the object of a sentence. We'll get to that as well. But these are the things that are going to be tested. We can take time now to answer these questions if you like. You'll get faster at this process of sort of keying in on what the differences are and therefore what they're trying to see if you know. In the first passage, I can look at the underlying parts. Between building more than twice its height. I'm talking about this theater, so it's going to be an it. I can take away there and there, which are going to suggest a group of things. It's either it's with an apostrophe or it's without an apostrophe. And I'm expected to know that it's with an apostrophe means it is. And this one shows possession. I want to say that the theater is between buildings more than twice it is height or its height. And the answer here is J. The next answer choice question that we have is that New Yorkers are tourists and New Yorkers alike regularly filling this theater. Here I know immediately something sounds off. If I cut out the fat, which is one of the strategies that we'll talk about as well, then I can eliminate some of these unnecessary words and try to focus on the noun and the verb. Tourists and New Yorkers filling this theater. Doesn't quite sound quite right, especially when I look at these words like stands, exemplifies that they currently do this. So tourists and New Yorkers fill. I can take away answer choice A and B. This leaves me with answer choices C and D. And the difference here is whether or not there's a comma or not. Do I need a comma? Tourists and New Yorkers alike regularly filling this theater in its 900-seat capacity. Or tourists and New Yorkers alike regularly fill this theater. Not only does D sound better, but it shows that I know that there's not a need here for an introductory clause. D is the correct answer. 48. Most are there to attend a performance. So most people are there for the arts. A few, for example, are likely to be theater architecture buffs. Well, that seems to go in a different direction. Which of my answer choice shows going in a different direction? Consequently suggests that there's a cause and effect. There's no such relationship. It's not that because they're there to attend a performance, they're likely to be architecture buffs. Those ideas are separate. H goes in a different direction. A few are there to attend. Most are there to attend a performance. A few, however, are likely to be architecture buffs. That one sounds good, but just in case. In fact, again, goes in the same direction, and so the only answer choice that makes sense here is H. 49. These architecture buffs, they come. Okay, so are likely to be architecture buffs they come to admire. Okay, this one almost starts the sentence over again. So I would either need some punctuation, and that's not what's tested here. So I need a word or phrase that can put here and make this one continuous statement. They are likely to be architecture buffs there to admire. Oh, that sounds pretty clear, concise, and easy to understand. But let's try the others. They are likely to be architecture buffs whom admire. I need to know that there's a word missing, to whom or for whom, and that wouldn't make sense there either. Okay, and if I include the word they, I've cut out some additional words, but I haven't solved the major problem, which is that by introducing a pronoun they, it's not necessary here. So there are likely to be architecture buffs there to admire. B is correct. Now, going forward, now that you're going to have the opportunity to look at some specific review items for grammar, language and usage, for punctuation, as well as sentence formation, topic development, and organization, unity type questions. But here are general strategies to help you get started in case you're ready to go on to the practice item section of this chapter. Those strategies are to avoid the sounds good method of answering questions. Try to key in on what the question is asking you and try to recognize or remember the specific rules that are associated with it. You won't have to remember whether something is present, progressive, or future perfect, but you will have to understand how the overall tense of a passage has to stay the same. Basically, they have to match. 27. Use the answer choices as clues to what is being tested. This allows you to focus on specific information and helps you recall these ideas in detail. Number 28, remember that more than one error can be tested in the same question. Do not choose an answer choice that creates a different problem. If all else fails, if you can't make it better, leave it alone. 29, choose short, concise answer. If all else fails, keep it short and sweet. Question number 30. If you read a sentence, cross out any fatty or unnecessary phrases. These include prepositional phrases, comma phrases, so these are phrases that are in between two commas, appositive phrases, and anything else that comes between two commas. Basically, this allows you to focus and avoid careless errors because the ACT will try to separate verbs and the nouns they're connected to as much as possible. They will also try to separate nouns and the phrases that modify them as much as possible. This creates uncertainty, and it allows the ACT to use tricky ways to assess very simple ideas. 31. Don't be afraid of no change. This is the correct answer about 25% of the time statistically. So understand that there doesn't have to be something wrong. And that's usually the logic that a lot of students think of. They think that there has to be something wrong. And so they'll spend a lot of times trying to find an error with something that's perfectly fine, rather than focusing their answers on other questions that need their attention. Finally, if the omit the underlined portion is an answer choice, give it a second look. As I said, the ACT likes to keep things short and concise. So if omit this part is available, then try taking it out and making sure as long as the sentence still makes sense. It may not have other details. It may not have as much style or flair, but the ACT prefers short, concise writing over writing that is verbose. This is actually something that is repeated and clarified in this rule. This is actually repeated and clarified in rule number 33. Avoid rivals to success. The ACT does not like redundancy. So if you choose an answer choice that has a noun, a phrase, or an idea that has already been presented somewhere else in the passage or the sentence, then eliminate this answer choice. The ACT does not choose answer choices are not correct if they are irrelevant, if they add information or details that are not directly or logically related to what's being discussed. Also, avoid verbosity. If any sentence choice is long, it makes the sentence more complicated and winding. That's not your best answer. Make sure that the writing remains concise and appropriate. Appropriate is also important because the ACT will generally, their answer choices will avoid using inappropriate or offensive language. So if a word doesn't feel right, if it feels like it might be offensive to any group of people, then that's not your answer choice either. I know avoid answers that don't belong, make sense, or fix every problem. Don't replace one problem with another. If you're left between the choice of those things, then leave it as is, or choose the simplest and shortest answer. Avoid lost time. Stick to your schedule and don't agonize over answers. If you are answering a difficult question and you've given it about 30 seconds, that should give you enough time to at least eliminate 2 possible answer choices. At this point, you've now given yourself a 50-50 chance of guessing. So guess and move on. Also, finally, eliminate sounds right and try to find a reason. Try to identify what the question is testing and focus on the difference between the answer choices. This will help you sort of focus on the rule that's being applied, even though you don't have to recite that rule specifically. With that, you're ready to take the English practice test. Take your time, but test in an environment that is specifically very, very close to the one that you'll be testing in on one Saturday sometime in the near future. Take a Saturday morning, get up early, and allow 45 minutes to answer the 75 questions that are linked in this chapter. After you're done testing, we will have time to go over the answer choices and review anything that might need to be seen. From there, you may want to watch additional videos or go back and look at some of the review materials that are available inside this chapter. Good luck.